And welcome to Hannity Tonight. The Republican Party is undergoing a major shakeup in Washington as it tries to find a new Speaker of the House. Now that House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy has dropped out of that race, reports are now surfacing that many Republicans, including the outgoing Speaker John Boehner, are encouraging Wisconsin Republican Paul Ryan to run. But Ryan's spokesman said he is still not throwing his hat in the ring. Here with reaction, former House Speaker, Fox News contributor Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, welcome back. Good to see you.
It's good to be with you. And your very hypothetical question on radio yesterday got a lot more reaction than I thought it would. So, you know, for whatever that's worth.
Well, I do want to ask you about that. I'm glad you're jumping the gun on me just a hair. Yeah, let me ask this first question. 60% of Republicans say they feel betrayed by Washington Republicans. I've got to be honest, I'm one of them. Do they have a right to feel that?
Yes.
Explain.
Well, you know, the most recent survey that Gallup did, by 60 to 32, the American people want a smaller federal government. They're not getting it. You look at people who believe in the Second Amendment. You have a president who is consistently violating the Constitution, who's now suggesting by executive order he's going to impose various forms of gun control that he could never get through the Congress. Every time you turn around, there is something more outrageous coming out of Washington, and the Republicans don't seem to be capable of organizing a successful opposition. I think I'm very sympathetic to the problems that John Boehner had. I don't know, frankly, that anybody could have done a much better job, but I think what you're seeing has to be put in context. The Freedom Caucus is a symptom of a much deeper anger in the country. They're a symptom of the Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, Ted Cruz, who between them have about 60% of the vote in the Republican primary. And I think the Washington establishment, whether it's the K Street lobbyists, it's the news media, or it's the Republican members of the House and Senate, need to understand we're in the middle of a historic change, not just politics as usual, and the country is increasingly angry.
I think one of the reasons Republicans feel betrayed is because promises keep being made that aren't kept. For example, repealing Obamacare or defunding Obamacare, using the power of the purse. Similarly, executive amnesty, they promised in 2014 that they would stop it. They couldn't even stop and defund Planned Parenthood in the most recent CR. You were the last speaker to work with a Democratic president. You balanced the budget. You gave the country welfare reform. You ran on 10 items. You called it a contract with America. And you kept every one of those promises. You voted on all 10 items in 100 days. Would you consider being Speaker again if asked?
Well, look, first of all, I think that the key challenge here, and I would say this to Paul Ryan, who is probably the smartest and most disciplined person in the House and who is the obvious person for everyone to turn to. This is not about personality. You had Eric Cantor knocked out in a primary by a stunning margin. And Dave Bratt, by the way, his successors, put out a very good list of the first 10 things House Republicans should do, well worth looking at. You've had Speaker Boehner reach the conclusion that it was too expensive and too painful to keep fighting. You had Kevin McCarthy, who I was for, thought was the logical next speaker. You had him just now stop. And people better understand this is not about finding a magic personality. The Republicans need to slow down. They need to go into a number of day-long conferences where they honestly listen to each other. Every one of those 247 won an election. Every one of them deserves to be heard. But then you can say to every one of them, now, you have to listen to the rest of us, too. And they've got to come up with a strategy which moves us towards the values of the American people and which successfully takes on Barack Obama and curtails him as an unconstitutional president.
It seems that all President Obama and the Democrats have to do is threaten a government shutdown. You weren't afraid of a government shutdown. Isn't that how you achieved a lot of your success? Isn't that what your legacy is in part based on?
Sure, that's one of the reasons I'm confident that your fantasy will never become true, because for example, I don't see how you can allow the President of the United States to arbitrarily, personally extend curtailing the Second Amendment right to bear arms by an executive order and do nothing. But if you do anything, he's going to threaten to shut the government.
But wait a minute,
I could not, if I were still serving a...
But didn't Republicans embolden them when they didn't challenge him on executive amnesty? They basically gave him
of course.
do whatever you want card. You know, rule by executive fiat. Why wouldn't he do it again? It worked the last time.
Here are the two great secrets of being a failure in Washington. The first is to allow the Senate, in which the Democrats are far more ruthless and far more willing to stop everything, to become the definer of the fight. And the second is to be afraid to take the president on constitutionally. I read this piece this morning. It talked about the catastrophic 2013 shutdown. One of the most successful Republican elections in history was 2014. Highest number of House members since 1928. Took control of the U.S. Senate. Largest number of state legislators in the history of the party since 1856. Largest number. Yet this Washington reporter says this was a catastrophic shutdown. Give me 3 more catastrophes and we'll control everything. I mean, we have to understand, Ronald Reagan didn't look at weekly polls. Margaret Thatcher didn't look at weekly polls. And I'll tell you, in 1995, when we forced Bill Clinton to decide he wanted to actually implement welfare reform, and we forced him to agree that we're going to balance the federal budget, we didn't look at weekly polls. We looked at the nation, the future, and whether or not we could explain what we were doing.
Okay. Under John Boehner, our debt, national debt, went up $4.1 trillion. That is not exactly the principles, conservative principles of limited government or responsible governance, in my opinion, which is why I think he's in the positions that he's in today. I see a lot of conservatives. They're not even happy with Paul Ryan because of his positions on immigration, which they believe would ultimately lead to some amnesty or TARP or bailouts or spending plans. They don't feel it was dynamic enough. What is your reaction to those people?
Well, first of all, nobody's going to be perfect. Let's start there. I mean, if you picked the most perfect member of the Freedom Caucus and you put them in charge of the House, within 2 weeks, half the Freedom Caucus will be mad at him and half the rest of the conference will be mad at him. So just start with, these are troubled times. These are times that produce a Ben Carson, a Carly Fiorina, a Donald Trump, and on the other side, a Bernie Sanders. And we need to understand, people, if you can't set a standard of perfection, then nobody's going to meet that standard. But what you can say is, here's a question I would ask. Before they pick a speaker, and Paul Ryan is a very, very smart guy, and if he wants to run, I suspect he'll probably win, partly because people are frightened right now and they all want to rush to get to a decision rather than stop and think, because it scares them to be in this level of turmoil, and the news media is beating on them and saying, you got to do something right now or it'll look terrible and you'll be really bad, which is, by the way, all baloney. The election's over a year off. Don't worry about it. Try to think through what the right thing is, but I'll tell you, what I would ask of any potential speaker is, tell me your strategy. Explain to me how you're going to bring the Republicans together in the House. Explain to me how you're going to stand up to the Senate. And explain to me how you're going to curtail the most unconstitutional president in history.
Answer your 3 questions. If you were the person, what would you do?
Well, the first part I've already suggested to you. I think they've got to start by listening to each other at levels of depth that they have not thought about. They probably have to change some of the House rules to expand the opportunity for individuals to ventilate. You know, you run for office, you win office, you feel like you can't just be treated like you're a mushroom and they're going to dump you in the cellar and not ever tell you anything. You have a right as an elected representative to be a genuine part of the process, not just a tool of K Street or a tool of whatever ideological group is dominant this week. So one, they have to really think about some rules changes. They have to think about a whole new model of listening to each other and working together. 2, I think they've got to say to the Senate, we love you guys. We know you're doing the best you can in a terrible place, and we know that somehow Harry Reid keeps buffaloing you guys, and that Schumer's about to be his replacement in buffaloing you guys. We're going to do what is right for the U.S. House, and we'll go to conference. We'll see you in conference, and we'll work out everything in conference. But we're not going to pass in the House what you think you can pass in the Senate, because the Democrats won't let you pass things that matter. And finally, I'd say to the president, and this has to happen. If this does not happen, you're going to have a run of unconstitutionality that will be terrifying between now and the new president coming in 2017. I would say to the president, you're out of money. You want to close the government, close the government. Let's go to the American people and talk about it. but we're not going to allow you to sell out America to the Iranians, who, by the way, are now the Russians' allies in Syria. We're not going to allow you to destroy the Second Amendment by executive fiat. We're not going to allow you to destroy the American process of immigration and citizenship by executive order. We're not going to, and even George Will, who's a very solid establishment guy, has come out for impeaching the head of the Internal Revenue Service, which affects every taxpayer in the country. Well, you know, there's an easy gimme. I mean, if George Will thinks this guy's bad enough, and Andy McCarthy began calling for it a year ago, surely the House Republicans have an easy target to start down the road on. They're going to set up a committee on Planned Parenthood. That's the right step. Trey Gowdy's doing a great job, and I think we're going to be startled how many bad things we learn about Clinton and national security over the next few weeks. So there are things you can do that begin to crowd in Obama and weaken his ability to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, you saying you don't want the job reminds me of Gladiator and Maximus being asked by Marcus Aurelius, and he says, with all my heart, no. And then he says, well, that's why it should be you. You made a pretty articulate case that you'd be a good speaker. But we'll come back. We'll have more with Newt Gingrich. What? I'm just giving my opinion. That sounded like somebody. You just sounded like
the guy gets sold into slavery and killed. This is your model for my life? He gets sold into slavery and killed.
It's not, but you were the most successful speaker in the last 50 years, by far. And what you just outlined is exactly what I would like to see in the next. So this leads me to my final question, because we're running out of time. We have 50 million Americans in poverty, 46 on food stamps, median income down $5,000 on Obama, 95 million Americans out of the labor force. You have China, you have Putin, you have Obamacare as a disaster, you have Hillary's emails, attempted hacks by everybody. Okay, I got your message. You're not seeking the speakership. But what role would you be willing to play to help these people, Republicans, get their act together? Because, frankly, if they don't, I really worry if we'll ever solve these problems and really solve, these are significant times we're living in.
Look, we have a lot of good candidates for president. We have a lot of very smart House and Senate members. I try to work with as many of them as want me to. I don't call on them and I say, gee, can I come help you? But anybody who calls me, I try to take the time and I try to sit down with them and work things through. But I will also tell you, I am an optimist, despite everything you just said. This is the most extraordinary country in history. There are 315 million Americans. They are increasingly angry. They want to see real change. And in American history, when you start getting 60 and 70% of the country that wants real change, the politicians follow the people. The people don't follow the politicians. And that's what we're living through in the House. We're presently going to see it in the Senate, and you're sure seeing it in the presidential campaign.
You gave us the last balanced budget. You gave us welfare reform, and you kept your 10 promises you made. That's something we haven't had in a long time. Mr. Speaker, appreciate you being with us. I hope you can give these guys some help, and whatever role that is, I think it'll be very useful. Thank you.